Good evening. It's Monday, coming again to you from our home studio. Even got my microphone here for recording the music for worship on Sunday and for the rest of this Holy Week. Kind of a to do, but it's also kind of a fun thing to do as well. Um, Gonna end the time by singing Song 347. If you have your hymnal, go to Dark Gethsemane as we head toward Maundy, Thursday, and the events of Holy Week. And continuing on reading Knowing Jesus by James Allison. He just got done sharing a bit about, which is interesting to think about, um, that the Passover celebration is a commemoration of an expulsion. If you remember that story, um, Pharaoh wouldn't let God's people go. But then all of these plagues happen. 10 plagues happen. And then it's a get out of here. Everything will be made right again if we can just remove you. And so the kind of creation of God's people from Egypt is based on that getting kicked out. And everything that followed was teaching God's people to live as people who don't express power in the same way that their Egyptian overlords did, and who don't make things right by kicking people out. And so he continues on with this kind of thinking. Now it is in the midst of this that Jesus comes and celebrates his Passover meal. Please notice that he didn't celebrate a sort of mock Passover or a parody of the Passover with his disciples so as to give them a different critical basis for their relationship to Israel. He celebrated the Passover. That is, he inscribed his own understanding of what he was doing and what God was doing within the framework of the setting free of Israel. The victimary understanding of the chosen people, the giving of the covenant. It was not something done instead of the Jewish Passover. It was the Jewish Passover in its fulfillment. The Jewish Passover celebrated the night before his death by someone who knew that he was about to be murdered. There's a great deal of Jewish material here that we may need reminding of, which may seem excessively complicated to us, but which would have immediately rung all sorts of bells for Jesus' contemporaries. We may be tempted to think that all these allusions and echoes which we need to have explained to us, they also needed to have been explained to them. Well, there was a lot that Jesus did need to explain to them, but to Jesus' contemporaries, much of this would have been assumed. For instance, when Jesus chose 12 disciples to be the leaders of his followers, this had a specific set of resonances. 12 was the number of the tribes of Israel, and the choice of the 12 was a form of prophetic announcement that Israel was to be restored. In the same way, the announcement both by John and by Jesus and his disciples that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, or the kingdom of God is at hand, would have struck its first hearers as saying something about the restoration of Israel as the chosen vehicle of God's kingdom. The notion of God's kingdom would not have been heard as a vague term in which abstract qualities like justice and peace and mercy and faithfulness flourished. The automatic assumption would have been that it was very much bound to conceptions of the fulfillment of Israel and its historical institutions. Even after the resurrection, the apostles asked Jesus in Acts 1, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" It would be quite wrong for us to see Jesus as simply ditching Israel and its hopes. He was subverting those hopes from within, operating from within the web of expectations that people had. This can be seen from the way in which Jesus conducts his mission before going up to Jerusalem. He sets up a new trek, going across the Sea of Galilee rather than the Red Sea, and starting to feed the people as Moses and Joshua had done on their way to the Promised Land. His teaching people about the scribes and Pharisees often carries the implication that they are Egyptians, from whom Israel must be set free. Here it is important not only that Jesus is revealing himself to be more than Moses, more than Elijah, more than Solomon, more than Jonah, more than Joshua, to name but the most significant of the Old Testament figures whose actions are recast and fulfilled by Jesus' own actions. It is important also that he is working out the whole framework of his mission within an understanding of God's relation with Israel. The Israel of God, which Jesus prepared and brought out, was never intended simply as a break from Israel, but a subversion from within, so as to recast the meaning of Israel from within those categories that people already had. I say all this since the Last Supper makes no sense without a background understanding of what was being signified in the midst of what was already a highly symbolic meal. Just as the Passover meal interpreted the expulsion or flight from Egypt, so Jesus used the Passover meal to interpret his coming expulsion. Again, he made clear that he knew what was going on before the expulsion. There is present both the element of free self-giving and the element of a victimary lynch. However, it is the free self-giving that interprets the lynch. Thus, Jesus is able to talk about his blood poured out for many, borrowing the language of the suffering servant from Isaiah. The Passover celebrated the flight from Egypt, which led to Sinai, where Moses had made the covenant between the people of Israel and God. It was that covenant which established Israel as the people of God. The rite of the covenant in Exodus 24 involved the sprinkling of blood over the altar and over the people. This was not, in all probability, a sacrifice for the expiation of sins when it was first performed. But by Jesus' time, it was understood as such. In Jesus' Passover supper, according to all the accounts we have, Jesus used the language of covenant. He saw himself as establishing a new covenant in his own blood, in which he was both Moses and the oxen, both priest and victim. John has all this another way. John is Jesus being crucified a day earlier, at the time when the priests were slaughtering the Passover lambs in the temple for the evening meal. He has the irony of the real sacrificial lamb being killed outside of the city, and wearing a seamless tunic, the garment of the priest on his way to Golgotha. So Jesus is the lamb, the priest, the temple, and the victim all at once. John's deep and continual irony shows an entirely secular event, a semi-legal lynch death, as the real sacrifice which simultaneously shows up the nullity of religious sacrifice and reveals the real basis by which humans maintain social order. There are many further elements to Jesus' Passover, which I'll deal with one in particular. All the accounts except Paul's have the element of the blood being poured out for many. This is the use of the language of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Jesus is linking the Passover with the theme of vicarious expiation, which is to be found in Isaiah. Traditionally, insofar as these passages of the Jewish scriptures were interpreted at all, it was to see Israel as the suffering servant, bearing the sins of the world. Jesus gives it quite a new meaning, since it becomes personal and messianic. Jesus then commands his disciples to do this in memory of him, thus giving this particular recasting of the Passover meal the same sort of function in the new Israel, the one Jesus was founding in his person, that the original Passover meal had had for Israel. It was to become the memorial feast whose celebration was to bring to memory and thus make really present the act of God which was being celebrated on behalf of the people. The depth of Jesus' teaching and action is that he fulfills and subverts at the same time. The fulfillment is always subversive of, corrective of, the current practice. Now I concentrate on this, the Last Supper, since it is how Jesus before his death interpreted his own death. It was how he showed that he was giving himself freely and yet being killed. It was how he shifted the meaning of the Passover, the covenant, the election of Israel, onto his person, such that the new Israel was to be a people who were founded in his lynch expulsion, just as the previous Israel was founded in their lynch expulsion. Please note that what I am talking about, once again, is the intelligence of the victim. I've been talking of the way in which Jesus had a project for the refounding of the new Israel, which had to pass through his rejection, and where that rejection would in fact be the foundation for a new Israel. All this must have seemed deeply mysterious to the disciples, even as they shared the Passover celebration with Jesus. It was only after the resurrection, when they began to share the intelligence of the victim, that they began to see what it was all about. What they came to see was that the new Israel had been founded in those words, "This is my blood of the covenant which is poured out for many." The deliberative self-giving of Jesus into the hands of his murderers was, and had been understood, to be by Jesus a salvific act. It had made possible a new basis for humans to relate to each other. at Gethsemane, all who feel the tempter's power, your Redeemer's conflict see. Watch with him one bitter hour, turn not from his griefs away, learn from Jesus Christ to pray. Follow to the judgment hall, view the Lord of life arraigned. Oh, the wormwood and the gall, oh, the pangs his soul sustained. Shun not suffering, shame, or loss, learn from him to bear the cross. Calvary's mournful mountain climb, there adoring at his feet, mark that miracle of time, God's own sacrifice complete.